Hello everybody and welcome back to Real History. I'm your host, History Professor Jared Frederick, and we are joined in this episode by a very special guest, Jason Capra. Thank you so much for joining us in this episode.
Thanks for having me, Jared. Appreciate it.
As his very cool leather jacket here would suggest, Jason is an actual pilot, and we are going to be putting his expertise to the utmost in this episode as we take a look at the beloved 1990 aviation classic, Memphis Belle. Before we talk a little bit about your passion for aviation, perhaps you can tell us a little bit as to how and why this film sparked your interest in a lot of that history.
I first saw this movie, I think I was in kindergarten when this first came out, and I'd already been obsessed with aviation, especially World War II aviation. But I remember seeing this in the movie theater. Like I said, I was just a little kid, and I think it was seeing those big green Boeing B-17 bombers going airborne, that takeoff sequence.
Yeah.
And this movie lit a fire in me that has yet to be extinguished.
All right, there you go.
Here we are 30-some years later, and I still get excited watching this movie.
And that led you to perhaps your biggest passion project ever. Perhaps you can introduce our audience to Beach City Baby.
Sure. So Beach City Baby is a Douglas C-53 Sky Trooper. World War II veteran, flew active combat all through World War II, North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Southern Europe. C-53 is a lot of guys or folks don't know what that is, but it's actually a forerunner to the C-47. At the beginning of the war, Douglas was asked to produce a transport, and right at the beginning of the war, they didn't have the C-47s mass produced yet. So a lot of DC-3s that were supposed to be produced were drafted into the military. So a C-53 is essentially a C-47 with a DC-3 passenger door and a non-reinforced plywood floor. Other than that, the C-47 and the C-53 are almost identical. But this is kind of the pre-runner to the C-47.
Yep, and you take it around to air shows. And we want you to check the link below in the video description. You can visit the website for Beach City Baby. Perhaps check it at an airport as it is going to these various aviation shows, and find out how you can get involved in this worthy project. So we really appreciate you coming on the show today to share your expertise.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Well, let's not waste a moment further, and let's revisit Memphis Belle.
Excellent.
In the opening titles here, we see the name Catherine Weiler, and that is the daughter of William Wyler, who was the iconic filmmaker of the 1940s and onward, who made the original documentary that came out in 1944.
That is correct.
Memphis Belle. So there's a very unique family connection to be found in this movie. I'll also give a shout out to one of our faithful viewers, Brandon D. Nicola, who has extensively researched this movie, shares your fascination with it. He was kind enough to share with us some of his original research pertaining to the film. So Brandon, this one's for you.
I always like this scene here at the beginning where they're kind of playing football and stuff and just passing the time. This and baseball, I think the English were just absolutely mesmerized that these guys were out doing this stuff in between missions.
Filmmakers were originally looking to film this in the United States because that's where the bulk of historic aircraft were located. But then they quickly found out that to replicate the landscape of East Anglia was not going to be an easy thing. And I believe the majority of the film was shot at RAF Benbrook.
That's correct.
Active duty RAF base that they did a lot of cosmetic work on here.
Yep. A lot of the hangars in the background that you see there are the original, from World War II that were still actively used at that time.
I thought we hit that target a month ago, sir.
This film falls in a rather unique time frame as far as Hollywood history goes, because by the early 1990s, there had been a long dry spell, a time period without a lot of war movies, particularly World War II movies. It seems like World War II movies ended in the late 1960s.
That's correct.
And then didn't really pick up until Saving Private Ryan came about, but there's a few movies that aren't as well known, perhaps this one being among them, that predated Saving Private Ryan by a few years.
I always like that scene there. It's just so pretty.
Yeah, you're never going to have a movie like this again.
No.
And they really did a lot of clever camera work and trickery
Yes.
to give the illusion that there were more planes than what there were. I think they only had 5
Yep.
planes in total, but they would paint the name of one plane on one side of the nose and then the name of another on the other side of the nose.
So as they were taxiing around, you would just the illusion of more
Yes.
aircraft. Plus a lot of models, large scale RC airplanes, and depth of perception with the lens made it look like there was a lot more. So this scene here is an actual RC airplane. It was about a 1/4 scale B-17 that they bellied in or crashed for this scene. But the actual loss of the real B-17, which was a French B-17, is used for the wreckage that they show in the field.
It's very convincing, I think.
So you named the plane after your girl back home.
Here we're introduced to Matthew Modine's character, who is a very loose interpretation of Captain Morgan, the real-life skipper of the Belle. And in the film, he's presented as this rather timid, shy, no-nonsense captain. But Morgan was very much a maverick and somewhat of a colorful individual who wasn't really like this.
I honestly thought it was amazing that they didn't switch the co-pilot's character and the captain's character around, because the gentleman that plays the co-pilot in this is more like Captain Morgan than the guy that Matthew Modine's character is.
That's fair. There's talk in the film, John Lithgow's character, that this crew had gone through 25 missions without a scratch, which wasn't necessarily the case, because the crew members were often alternating back and forth between other planes. Some of them had flown more missions than others. For Bob Morgan in particular, he flew his 25th mission on May 17th, 1943, but the plane didn't fly its 25th mission until 2 days later. So there's a lot of fuzzy math about, oh, when is the 25th mission and who flew the 25th mission and were they really, unscathed throughout the whole process? The plane was damaged on many occasions leading up to it.
Yep. And it was unique how many different crews would fly on different airplanes, and it really kind of had a unique path, if you will, to that 25 mission mark.
You'll go back home in the Belle, fly all over the U.S., making speeches, getting people to buy more war bonds, work longer hours, put out more planes. And believe me, you'll be wined, womened, and songed from one end of the States to the other.
In all these conversations about all the fanfare associated with the 25th mission, it's worthwhile to point out a few things. One is that Memphis Belle wasn't going to be the original title of this film. It was going to be Southern Belle, because they thought people would be angry if they gave this fictionalized spin with the name of a real famous plane. But apparently the surviving crew members of the Belle gave the thumbs up because they thought that it would highlight their story and show it to a new generation of viewers.
Correct. It's also, I think the Air Force was very concerned about copyright issues. That's what they didn't give them permission to use the actual font on the nose of the typewriter type Memphis Belle. So when they came out with the nose art for the movie Memphis Belle, it was in cursive.
I suspect a lot of that had to do with promoting the movie as well. The sort of cursive style was certainly more indicative of that sort of 1940s flair that we often associate with nose art. So perhaps it was a good bit of a commercial strategy as well.
Yep.
Hey, dirty book.
Hey, I'll take it. The part where they're cleaning out the footlocker, even though it's in some ways depicted as a bit of comedic relief initially, this was a very true and profound and real-life dilemma that men in these huts had to contend with, going through the belongings of your fallen comrades, and additionally, as they're doing here, removing things that that person wouldn't want sent home, a dirty book, condoms, love letters to someone who's not your wife. These things actually happen. And so your comrades had to censor your personal belongings before your footlocker was sent home to save loved ones any unneeded grief.
I plan to open a whole bunch of restaurants exactly like the first one. right? So you could go to Detroit, say, and get the exact same hamburger you got in Baltimore or Philadelphia.
First, nobody's gonna want to get the same old food everywhere they go.
Was the founder of McDonald's or any of the fast food restaurants in the 8th Air Force in World War II?
I don't think Ray Kroc was in the 8th Air Force, but I do know that Dave Thomas, the founder of Wendy's, right after World War II, he was a cook in the 4th Infantry Division.
Oh, okay.
And so he figured out how to streamline feeding a lot of people in fast order. And I have no doubt that his time as an Army cook was foundational to him becoming the founder of Wendy's.
Didn't know, I don't know if you knew this or not, but the 2 gentlemen that started Waffle House were both pilots in the 8th Air Force.
Okay, wow.
If you go into the Waffle House, all of them have pictures of them in their wartime uniforms. So maybe a little bit of credibility to that storyline.
As we take a look at this very romanticized depiction of a hangar dance that's going on, it leads to the question, would something like this have been acceptable on an English base during the war with all of the concerns about enemy infiltration, spies, wartime security? Is inviting 1,000 people into your hangar an advisable tactic to build goodwill with the British? On the flip side, I know of at least one unit, the 489th Bomb Group, after they passed their 100th mission, they had a huge shindig on their base and had ice cream and had dances and they had the locals come in. So maybe it's not a stretch after all.
I've heard many stories where they would have, dances or get-togethers where they would invite the local towns girls in, especially the single towns girls, you know, and try and give the guys something to look forward to.
You've never had a hamburger?
It's been so long since I had any meat.
The American men were away from their American women and the British women were away from their British men.
Yep.
And this is why we have some 20,000 Anglo-American babies born throughout the latter phases of the war.
Absolutely. You know, this part here, this is kind of, I don't know, some people might deem this part as being Hollywood, but I can attest to the fact that as a pilot, there is a attachment that you get with your aircraft. And I know with Beach City Baby, there's been many a times in the evenings at the end of an air show or when we get back to the hangar at the end of a weekend getaway where, just talking to the aircraft like it's a living, breathing thing isn't so far out of reach. It really is a kinship that a lot of pilots develop with the aircraft that they fly, especially a warbird.
And while he's standing here at the nose of the plane, it's noteworthy to mention who it's named after. Who is the Memphis Belle?
That would be Margaret Polk from, I think, Memphis, Tennessee is where he met her.
Yep.
Ironically, they didn't stay together for the whole war.
Yeah.
So.
And the story that I heard is that the Memphis Belle was saved from the scrap heap about 3 years after the war by the mayor of Memphis, who wanted to save this famous namesake of his city. And
that's correct.
It was pretty much remained in Memphis until the early 2000s when the Air Force recovered it.
Yep. It spent time at a VFW and then was moved to Mud Island, Tennessee, with the museum there. And they had cosmetically restored it a couple of times. It had the Memphis Belle reunion there where all the crew members were together for the last time, I believe. But as time went on into the late 80s, early 90s, the airplane really started to deteriorate. And it was finally when the Air Force Museum was contacted and the agreement came to get it off of Mud Island.
Let's hear it for the crew of the Memphis Belle. Hip, hip.
No.
Hip, hip.
It's bad luck.
Hip, hip.
The very awkward, the very premature and awkward victory toast here by Colonel Derringer. It's something that's worth thinking about is the fact that it was 4 days before the Memphis Belle completed its 25th mission that the B-17 Hells Angels completed its 25th. But I think this scene strikes a chord because these airmen were very superstitious.
Very much so.
They all carried talismans on them for one reason or another, and they didn't want to jinx their luck. So the reaction here, I think there's a degree of truth to it.
Absolutely.
Even though it's perhaps overplayed for the sake of the movie.
This buddy of mine keeps begging me to sing it.
Of course, at this time when the movie was made, Harry Connick Jr. had a singing career, so the push to have him sing in the movie was...
This was his first movie.
Was plugged, yes.
This is his very first movie,
Yep.
so it works though. He sounds the part of a
Sure
1940s
does.
crooner.
Yep.
He looks the part too.
Absolutely. Got that Frank Sinatra look going on.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Even when I was young and I first saw this movie, the part with all the balloons falling, I was like, rubber rationing. I don't think that they would have been doing that. That's a lot of rubber gloves.
Yep.
And other utensils of war.
Yep.
Could very well be used for better purposes. So a little bit of exaggeration there.
Just a little bit. Now, I always like this scene here with the airplanes as the sun's just starting to come up. There's something, as a pilot, very surreal about walking around a flight line this time of day, when it's just you and the airplanes. It's probably my favorite time of the day on the flight line, but especially around the old warbirds. It's just, there's no better time.
Is that because there's a lack of people? You can kind of connect with the plane in a more intimate way? What's the rationale there?
I think because when you normally see them out on the flight line at an air show, there's thousands of people everywhere, right? And then you get this very unique chance brief encounter where it's just you and the machines, and it's quiet, and they're out where they're supposed to be. They're not in a museum. They're not covered in dust. They're on the flight line. They're getting ready to fly.
Yeah.
But that opening scene with the sun coming up and the silhouette of those classic airplanes on the ramp, it's just, it's soul stirring.
Where's Lieutenant Lowenthal?
Where's Phil?
He's in the can. He couldn't sleep. The guy had nerves.
There's a lot of things going on in tandem here. We see them being woken up in the pre-dawn darkness. You'd often have a sergeant or a corporal come into your barracks with a flashlight because you didn't want to wake up other pilots who were recovering from their previous day's flight who may not be going out on this mission with you. And then that is followed by all of these wonderful scenes that just show this bustling hive of activity on the flight line, in the hangars. I can't think of a World War II movie that does better in showing just how busy
100%.
a base like this is.
Yep. And it was a constant hive of activity. It was nonstop, 24/7. You know, the airplanes were always being maintained or getting ready for flight, and just the constant. I don't think that people understand how much effort it takes, even today, to keep one of these old airplanes flying.
Oh yeah.
These powdered eggs would gag a buzzard.
You done with that?
The complaining about food is also a very authentic aspect of all this. Powdered eggs, powdered milk. Sometimes you might get some good meat that wasn't too dried out. But one pilot told me that they never received beans. They never received anything that was acidic.
Correct.
Because, well, why is that so? Give us some technical insight.
So you could technically have all kind of problems with expelling gas at altitude in an unpressurized aircraft to the point where it might even kill you. So, like I said, you really wouldn't want to have that opening, if you will, or pressure change internally. So, you know, that wasn't necessarily a good thing. The other problem too was, you know, urination in an unpressurized aircraft at 20-some thousand feet. You know, literally things would freeze in a matter of seconds. Yeah. So the problem of having frostbite with liquid all over your leg or whatever was a serious concern.
Yeah, had to be careful how much coffee you drank in the morning.
Pretty much, yes. That was not the time to want to have to use the restroom.
The target for today is Bremen.
I'd imagine that for every mission you went on, you know, these guys didn't know where they were going until that curtain came back.
Right.
You know? And seeing what was unveiled when that rolled back, just as these guys are doing here, you know, just the dread of knowing where they were going.
And a lot of commanding officers did this with great melodrama. David Strathairn, I love David Strathairn, great character actor. He is loosely based off of the real-life Colonel Stanley Ray of the 91st Bomb Group. And he tells everybody here that the mission for today is Bremen, and everybody goes, ah. In reality, though, the last mission of the Memphis Belle, as it is celebrated, was to Wilhelmshaven.
Correct.
And I suppose they changed it to Bremen because it's a little bit deeper into Germany, but perhaps make it sound a little bit more ominous. They elevate the stakes a little bit.
Yeah, Germany. Yeah. Yes. So this scene is hands down my favorite scene of the entire. Well, one of my favorite scenes. Just them coming out to the airplane and all the hive of activity to getting one of these airplanes ready to fly. You know, because again, there's an army of men behind the scenes that never get celebrated, and that's the ground crew. Yeah. And just how much and how hard these guys had to work throughout the night to get these airplanes ready to fly in the morning. But this is a great nod to them and just that hive of activity around the aircraft, you know, with getting it ready to fly. And these guys are literally closing up their toolboxes as the crews are pulling up, you know.
And with Masters of the Air, the mechanics finally get their due with characters like Ken Lemons and whatnot. So, mechanics are always seen on the periphery here. I believe one of the characters that was a mechanic in this one was actually written out, perhaps in the editing process.
So ironically, with this movie, I was obsessed as a kid when I first saw it with getting a leather A2 jacket and a crush cap. I received both of those by the time I was in 4th grade, and I wore both of them out. So, but it was because of this movie. Every air show I went to as a kid, I had my leather A2 and my captain's hat on.
This is a radio check. Charlie, Uncle Victor, Tango.
So the reason he's grabbing his neck there, those are called throat mics, and it would actually pick up on the vibration from your throat, so it was easier to understand the crew members, especially with all the noise going through the aircraft. Very uncomfortable, the crews hated them, but for 1940s technology, it was superb as far as clarity.
Didn't you hear? There's complete cloud cover over Bremen. We're not going anywhere.
This part always kind of cracked me up because he's running through a checklist to get the airplane ready to start, and they're clearly not going anywhere. But just a little bit of oversight maybe on the Hollywood crew.
That's why you're here.
He's talking about the intercoolers and setting the brakes and essentially getting the airplane ready to fly when they know that they're not going anywhere for a couple hours. So a completely pointless exercise as far as the flight crew is concerned. So Verge's job, obviously, he's the flight engineer on the airplane. So even though the captain's in charge of the aircraft, your flight engineer was your flying mechanic. He was kind of the airborne mechanic that would work on systems and troubleshoot stuff for the crew while they were flying. So a lot of things that have changed in today's world as far as flying. When you fly as an airline pilot or even as a military pilot, you are trained to understand the aircraft inside and out, every system, every component, and you have to have a working knowledge of all of the systems and how they are all integrated with each other. At this time, because there was such a time crunch to get the pilots out and the airplanes out flying, they actually had a flight engineer. His job was just to monitor, know, and maintain the systems on the aircraft. So the pilots, the captain and the co-pilot, both had a working knowledge of the systems, but it was really the flight engineer's job to troubleshoot systems while they were flying in on the ground.
Anything, sir? Anything. Give me a dog.
We see the dog mascot being passed around, and the actual Memphis Belle crew had their own mascot dog, although it was a different dog. They had a Scotty dog named
Stuka.
Stuka. That's the best name for a World War II era dog.
Could not ask for a better one.
And Stuka thereafter went on the War Bond tour with them as well. I think Stuka was just as popular as any of the airmen who were on the plane.
There's quite a few really good shots of Stuka on the War Bond tour on the documentary that came out not too long ago with the Memphis Belle, or the Cold Blue.
Yes.
They show him quite a bit on there.
The years to come seemed a waste of breath. A waste of breath the years behind.
He's actually reciting a poem by Yeats at this moment. I believe it's about an Irish airman who doesn't come back from a mission. They took out the part about him being Irish in the movie, but it speaks of these universal ideas of loss and sacrifice that were going through the minds of all these guys.
This whole sequence is probably my favorite part of the entire movie here, the whole takeoff sequence.
It's just stunning. And once more, a lot of it is done with miniatures. There were 5 16-foot miniatures used for a lot of these scenes, and I think Christopher Nolan would really like this movie.
Absolutely.
Actually, because it's practical effects that is not reliant upon CGI, and damn it, it looks believable.
It's very believable.
Yeah.
I'll be honest with you. I actually prefer the models over the CGI.
Yeah.
I just think that there's a lot more realism associated with them. Now that whole starting sequence here on these airplanes, they showed them firing them up pretty quickly, but there's at least 2 to 3 minutes in between each engine start, waiting for systems to come up, waiting for oil pressure, hydraulic pressure. And even though there's 4 engines on these B-17s, only 2 of the engines actually provided pressure to your hydraulic and electrical systems.
There's a lot of scenes in this movie that recreate shots from the 1944 Memphis Belle documentary. And I rewatched that last night as a little bit of prep for our time together today. And one is, as they're prepping for takeoff, the cameraman in 1944 caught the wind blowing through the tall grass and the wheat, and that is a shot that they recreate here in this moment.
So one of the really interesting things was, and I'm going to nitpick a scene that we just saw there. So when you see the B-17 pulling away, right, when it starts its taxi, you see the pilot sitting in there. And for as much accuracy as they put into filming this, as the plane was pulling away, they had the green David Clark's headsets on from the 1980s, which drives me nuts. And ironically, another movie that has airplanes in it where it's so well done is Band of Brothers. On the takeoff sequence with the C-47s. You could see the modern David Clark's headsets on the pilot as the airplane's leaving the ground. And it just, you know. But only a true nerd like myself would pick up on.
I never noticed it.
Shooting the flare gun off to clarify clear for takeoff. They didn't want to use the radios just in case the Germans were listening. And then the wooden cutouts of the B-17s in the background.
Yeah. Very cleverly done. A lot of artistry went into just background stuff in this film.
So when they did this takeoff here, there was quite a crosswind that day. You can see the airplane yaws really hard to the right there, indicating that it was a right crosswind. So it's pushing the aircraft's tail to the left. And you can see there the crab as it's climbing out. So again, the really neat artistry with all the different watercolor nose art on the same airplanes used over and over again. And even the exhaust streaks and the black exhaust coming out of the vents on the tops of the wings. Just the attention to detail as far as the weathered look was just phenomenal in this.
Here we go, boys.
So the reason that you saw 2 hands on the throttles there, the captain always pushes the throttles up. We do the same thing on Beach City Baby. And he'll push it up to set it, and he'll say set power. And the co-pilot, because he's the non-flying pilot, will fine-tune the throttles, make sure they're set at the exact manifold pressure, and say throttle set, and then the captain puts his hands back on for the reject if the takeoff, if it's necessary. Beautiful shot there, that 17 lifting off.
In the days before drone photography and cinematography as such, this had to have been an incredibly difficult movie to film. Watching each other's clearance and making sure planes don't collide. Kind of scary,
Formation flying is a whole other aspect of flying that requires a lot of additional training on top of just being able to fly an aircraft. But the aerial photography that they used for that takeoff sequence was actually done with a Belle helicopter. But as you can see, the results were phenomenal.
Yeah, absolutely.
Beautiful shot here. Again, flying in clouds in formation is incredibly dangerous. As you can see, that's actual footage of that airplane flying through the clouds. And you don't have to be very far away from it to lose it completely. So just like in World War II, as they were climbing out, most mid-air collisions happened while they were forming up, climbing through the clouds. You had hundreds of B-17s fairly close to each other, losing sight of each other for 30 seconds to minutes at a time, and then trying to reassemble.
Mid-air collisions was not uncommon. Just some talented pilots pulling off a shot like that for the stunt work in this movie.
Very good scene. He was talking about the cowl flaps there when he was yelling to Tate Donovan's character about watching the cowl flaps. So the cowl flaps are the gills on the cowling, on the back side of the cowling that fluctuate. And there's control valves in the cockpit that allow them to open and close to allow more or less air over the cylinders for cooling purposes.
Captain, okay if I arm my bombs?
Yeah.
The arming of the bombs here was done just in case the aircraft had a abort a takeoff or would crash on takeoff. The bombs weren't armed, so you wouldn't take out half of the English countryside if it happened that way.
Which is why if the target was concealed, they would often dump their bombs in the North Sea or the Channel on the way back rather than land with a full arsenal in their bellies.
Because at that point, they had already armed the bombs, most likely. So David Talashe's B-17 was the one that was used predominantly as the Memphis Belle in the movie. The reason it was selected was because it was the only B-17 in the entire fleet of 5 they had that had 2 operational upper and lower turrets.
Right on the pickle barrel, huh, Dennis?
That's right.
Yeah, so they always used to say that they could, the Norton bomb sight was so accurate that they could drop a bomb from in a pickle barrel from 5 miles up. So the saying was right in the pickle barrel. And that kind of just was a saying that stuck throughout the war. So this scene right here, him taking his gloves off as they're climbing up at altitude was a big no-no.
Yeah.
And a little bit of Hollywood for the sake of the movie. There also, too, with the 160-mile-per-hour winds whipping through those open waist guns, that paper would have ripped off the second he put it on his back. At this time, when the Memphis Belle was on its last mission, which was May of 1943, the P-51s hadn't come out yet. They weren't used as long-range escorts. So at this time, they would have had squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolts, which they didn't have enough flying ones for this movie when they made it. However, the paint scheme that the Mustangs have is the paint scheme that the P-47s would have had on them at the time, with the white cowling and the olive drab paint.
Is that forgivable in your mind?
I'll let it go on this one. Again, at this time, right now, I think there's close to 6 or 7 airworthy P-47s. But when this movie was made, I think there was only 2 or 3, and none of them were in Europe at that time.
We better sign off. Okay, thanks, Danny. I won't bother you again.
A lot of the chatter from plane to plane wasn't permitted because, like you said, the Germans could pick up on those frequencies, but it's something that not all crews abided by.
Correct. Now, intercom chatter, which is internal within the aircraft itself, obviously these guys would talk to each other the whole way over and the whole way back. But yes, from plane to plane, very, very minimal conversation unless it was absolutely necessary. You can't beat the air-to-air shots in this movie.
It's very reminiscent of Battle of Britain, which came out 20 years prior to this.
Yep.
A lot of that same technique.
Yep.
You just can't beat it.
Nope. Ironically, a lot of the Messerschmitts in this movie were also the same Messerschmitts from the Battle of Britain.
Ah, interesting.
Which aren't real Messerschmitts. So they're the fuselages of Me-109s that were built in the 50s by Spain with Merlin engines in them.
I heard about that.
So they're real Me-109 bodies with Spitfire engines in them.
They're passable.
They're identical except for the cowling on the front. Classic airplane being shot down, white smoke. Battle of Britain, Memphis Belle. It's basically just dumping engine oil onto the hot exhaust, and you get that white trailing smoke. A lot of aircraft had that system installed for air shows. I couldn't even imagine how uncomfortable being in that ball turret for 6, 7, 8 hours at a clip would have been.
Ain't it the truth? And I suppose that's a good chance for me to talk about the local connection that I have with the ball turret gunner, the real-life ball turret gunner of the Memphis Belle. The real-life man was Cecil Scott, and he was from the same town that I'm from, Altoona, Pennsylvania.
Yep.
And he worked on the Pennsylvania Railroad for a while, later moves to Detroit, works in the automotive industry at a later point. But he's moderately well known in these parts. Unfortunately, he died a fairly young man. He was already dead by the time they were making this film.
Again, with the attention to detail, every time they show the tail gunner, they show the frost all over the windscreens. And again, that was fairly accurate for him, especially because he had such a tight enclosed quarter. There was no way to keep that from happening. Well, there's a big no-no, taking your gloves off and holding a metal chain at 30-some thousand feet.
He couldn't have pretended to throw that out the window because it would have stuck to his finger.
Yeah.
Yeah, to my knowledge, they did not plan on an extravaganza like this, although there was a fair amount of celebrating when they did get back. It was more spontaneous.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe his mother and I raised him right after all.
I like this moment of realization that John Lithgow's character, Colonel Derringer, has, where it strikes him for the first time that this isn't merely a matter of good public relations and selling war bonds, that the likes of Colonel Harriman, played by David Strathairn, it's a matter of life and death. And then that's followed by the juxtaposition of this real-life footage that we see being incorporated in here. So perhaps a little bit melodramatic, but I think it gets the point across too.
Absolutely.
And our friend Brandon, who was able to supply us a good bit of research regarding this movie, points out that in the book tie-in for the movie, it explains a little bit further about Colonel Harriman, that he didn't want to send the Memphis Belle on this mission, but because of that B-17 that crashed at the beginning of the movie, he has to replace them with an able crew. So, as is often the case with movie tie-in books, you can get into the minds and thinking of your characters, even if they are fictionalized to a greater extent.
I hope everybody's wearing their flak jackets.
And now we see them putting on their flak vests and their helmets, which were typical GI helmets, but one bomb group had improvised putting flaps down over the side, and then that became a formalized thing for air crews at a later point in the war.
Yep.
War is often the mother of invention.
And again, at this time when this was taking place would have been, again, spring of 43. So that's why only one of them has it. He probably traded for it or had someone make it for him, but it wasn't standard issued amongst all of them at that time.
She's all yours.
Roger.
Here we're introduced to the Norden bomb site. Firstly, tell us how it worked, and two, does the movie get it right?
So I actually do. It's interesting they show that the autopilot is being turned on at that time because the Norden bomb site is being slaved to the aircraft's autopilot system at this time. Again, very rudimentary compared to what we have today. But again, you've got a machine or a mechanical device at this point on these airplanes, and I don't want to, I'm thinking it was hydraulically controlled, or it may have been electrical. I don't know too much about the B-17's autopilot system. However, you're making small corrections to the flight control cables via either mechanical or hydraulic levers, essentially. So again, the autopilot, the Norden bomb site was so technologically advanced at that time. That's why only so many of the airplanes had them. And again, it was a computer, essentially. Yeah. But you can see that the bombardier, as you heard him say, is flying the airplane. So the autopilot system is now connected to the computer of the Norden bomb site and is making these small little intricate inputs to the flight controls of the aircraft, and is actually flying the B-17 via the autopilot system. Again, very guarded, very, very revolutionary at that time. And again, to think that aircraft themselves, just 30 years prior, were a new invention.
Yeah, absolutely.
So here you have an autopilot system already.
Yeah, but it wasn't like a simple vector like this film kind of. The film doesn't quite get it right,
no,
it empowers the bombardier more than perhaps it should.
He is making minor adjustments via the Norden bomb site with heading and altitude, but he's not actually flying the airplane.
Right. Well, here we have one of the great jump scares of the film. First time I saw this, now I saw it a lot later in life than you did. I was probably in middle school.
Okay.
I bought it on VHS at Target. That really ages it. And I'd never seen or heard of the movie before, but it was like in the $5 bin. I'm like, oh, that sounds good. And then I saw it. I'm like, this is amazing.
Yeah.
And of course, I jumped out of my seat when this moment. Do you recall seeing this moment?
I do.
What was your reaction first time you saw the tomato soup explode?
Couldn't believe that one of the pilots got killed or shot. It was, or someone down below. But I was confused because neither one of them knew what was going on, just like I didn't know what was going on. And I think that they did an amazing job with the shock factor of it and really kind of catching you off guard and getting your heart rate up a little bit, because here's the two kind of main characters of the movie and you're assuming that one of them just got mortally wounded based on the explosion that we see in the cockpit here.
And the disappointing aspect of this, historically speaking, is that none of these guys would have taken liquid with them because it would have frozen
immediately.
You couldn't have drank tomato soup.
No. Even in a Stanley thermos, it still would have frozen. Yep.
But man, like to deliver on the shock value, it definitely works cinematically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
We're losing fuel!
So again here,
Get on the fuel transfer pump!
Obviously they took a flak burst to the wing and they're losing fuel. So on all these big multi-engine aircraft from this time, even our C-53, you've got multiple fuel tanks. And you do have the ability on some of them to transfer fuel from one fuel tank to another. So if you would have, like they do, a hole in it, you can try and move that fuel over to another fuel tank system, and you can still feed all the different engines off of a different fuel tank. So a little bit of reality there, and a really neat systems integration into the movie as far as the B-17 is concerned. The special effects with the flak going off is phenomenal.
Yeah, I don't know how they did it, but it looks really good.
It does.
And I've spoken with a number of World War II pilots who flew through flak, and what they often said was, if you just saw the black smoke of it, you were probably okay. But when you could see the red cordite center of it, they said, holy hell, that's when you really knew you were in trouble, because that means that they had you targeted, you were bracketed, and you were going to be flying through the thick of it.
Yep.
So if you saw the red burst, you were in a world of trouble.
But there's civilians down there. There's a school right next door, and if we don't drop these bombs right in the pickle barrel, there's going to be a lot of innocent people killed.
What's the difference? They're all Nazis.
This is really where we get into some silly semantics. Because despite all of the propaganda about the Norden bomb site and dropping bombs in the pickle barrel, when you think about saturation bombing or carpet bombing, if you're going to bomb a factory next to a school, you're going to hit the school no matter what.
Yeah. And more oftentimes is that, that unfortunately stuff like that would take place. There's a little bit of Hollywoodism going on here to come back and really be as accurate as possible.
Yeah. But I mean, the truth of the matter is if the target was concealed, they have these things called a secondary target.
Yep.
And they also have a tertiary target as well. And so rather than looping around, which was almost never done.
You're burning extra fuel.
Yeah.
You're burning oil, and now you're subjecting yourself to, the fighters again. So again, maybe not the most realistic execution of that scenario.
Yeah. The initial point, the IP, when planes would start turning on the bomb run, that is when they were most vulnerable. That's when guys were really gritting their teeth.
Yep.
Going into all of this and turning around to follow the same route that the Germans gunners are fixed on is not advisable in the least.
No. And again, at this time, you're leaving big white contrails up in the sky where everyone sees where you are and can see that you're turning back around to try again.
Yeah. Sorry, lovers of this film, but this is where it gets a bit ridiculous. There's a scene very much like this that plays out in the documentary where the chatter amongst the crew, it was recreated by William Wyler, but he tried to create this factual dialogue. And indeed, there's a plane that is filmed going down, and you hear the men on the Belle saying, "Come on, fellas, get out of there. What the hell, guys, jump."
Yep.
So there are these very poignant recreated moments in here, as was seen in the film of 45 years earlier.
Yep. And again, trying to get out of walking through a B-17 when it's sitting on the ground is difficult enough when it's at an air show. Being in one that's with all the centrifugal forces spiraling in a nosedive, trying to get out with all the gear, it would be next to near impossible.
It'd be like in a clothes dryer almost when you're in a tailspin.
Yep.
Yeah. Have you ever seen any behind-the-scenes photo of what this filming contraption looked like?
I haven't either.
They must have had this fuselage on top of a gimbal or something like that that created the idea, shock and turbulence.
I'll tell you, out of all the airplane movies I've seen and doing this in real life, the movements is probably one of the more realistic ones I've seen. It just the rattling, the noise, the jittering of the aircraft. It's very believable.
Mm-hmm.
So there were actual instances of ball turrets being ripped off of B-17s. Now, as far as anything like this actually happening, I'm unaware of any true accounts of the ball turret gunner being pulled back into the aircraft.
It's certainly hanging on by your fingernails sort of moment. And in some ways, it ties into a war movie trope, the idea of the imperiled ball turret gunner.
Yes.
I remember... not too long before this movie came out.
I know exactly what you're going to say.
Yeah, Amazing Stories.
Yes, with Kevin Costner as the B-17
I know, that's such a great episode.
Yep.
I love that.
Yep.
But that was something that war correspondent Andy Rooney did write about.
Yes.
That, they couldn't, the plane's wheels were out, they couldn't get this guy out of the ball turret, they got the Padre on the radio from base.
Yep.
He gave a final blessing, and
they bellied it in.
Yeah, and that was it. So it was not a great place to be.
No, it was definitely probably the least favorite position on the aircraft to be assigned to.
Yeah, though I believe not the most dangerous, though.
Very true.
Yeah.
Yep. The tail gunner position was the actual most dangerous position due to the attack methods by the Luftwaffe. Billy Zane's character has a very Clark Gable-like appeal. And I was wondering if they almost went for the Clark Gable look with him, because Clark Gable was an actual gunner on a B-17 in World War II.
Uh-huh. He definitely looks the part.
Mm-hmm.
I think he should have kept the mustache for Titanic just 7 years after this.
Yes,
I
agreed.
think it would have worked well for the smug aristocrat that he played in that movie.
Yep.
We've also taken a look at Titanic on Real History in 2 parts. Take a look at that one as well. It's a very deep subject. How difficult is it to pull out of a dive like that?
So I know in doing air shows with our C-53, when you're taking a big multi-engine airplane like that, that's all cables and pulleys, when we're down low and doing our show passes, we're really muscling that airplane through the sky.
Yeah.
And that's when it's doing what I want it to do. In a situation like this where you're kind of nose down and it's gaining speed heading downhill, it takes a lot of muscle to maneuver that aircraft around. You're fighting all of that airflow over those control surfaces by yourself. So it's how strong are you, and again, having another co-pilot, where they actually did have situations where in a dive or a situation like that, it would take both pilots on the yoke to get the aircraft to get to respond. A little bit of Hollywood, again, for dramatization in the movie, but the conveying of how much physical effort was used to do that, I think is fairly accurate.
All that said, when you look at some of the period photographs of the Belle flying in England, there's a lot of weird dark splotches all over the fuselage, and a lot of people think that that's camouflage. And I actually believe that that is where they patched the plane and repainted it.
It is not. Actually.
Oh, okay, good. All right.
It is not. So that was actually camouflage.
Okay. I'm glad to be proven wrong.
It was known as splotching.
Okay.
And it was a tech order that came out in late 1942 to break up the lines of the aircraft against the ground. Our C-53 Beach City Baby, when you look at our airplane, the way it's painted and restored is late 42, early 43, which is exactly when the Memphis Belle took place. And if you look at all of the leading and trailing edges on our DC-3, we have splotching as well. And again, that was to break up the hard lines of the aircraft's wings when you're looking down.
All right, I stand corrected.
Yeah. So they actually, the real Memphis Belle had the splotching, but for whatever reason, when they painted, I think for the ease of switching aircraft back and forth with the movie, they didn't add the splotching to the movie Memphis Belle.
And I love some of these shots with just the B-17s at low altitude coming over the tower.
Absolutely.
So I had the chance, I was at the 75th anniversary rededication of the Memphis Belle in Dayton, Ohio, at the National Air Force Museum. So I was there on the 75th anniversary of its final mission. And so I did living history and I did reenacting at that event. And so I got to stand up on top of the tower, much like we saw here, as the planes were coming in. I had my binoculars and everything. I was like, oh, this is so cool.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it was a very special weekend. I also had the chance to meet the last man who flew, the last living man who flew the Memphis Belle. He didn't fly it on any of the combat missions, but he flew it while it was on its war bond drive, and he was the last, last known man alive to have flown it.
No kidding.
This movie truly is a worst-case scenario film for a crew. We have wounded men aboard. Our plane's shot up.
Yep.
One of the engines went out.
Yep.
Our wheel isn't working. Not to say that that couldn't happen, but truly worst-case scenario for me.
It is a bad day for this crew. And what's really, again, getting into the technical side of it, right? So you're losing, right now they're losing another one, but you're losing engines. And when you're losing engines, the way to counteract that when you're flying an aircraft is by adding rudder. Well, obviously these guys have half the rudder shut off. So the sheer physical aspect of trying to keep this airplane flying exerted on the two pilots with what little flying controls they have left would really be a bad day at the office. Really bad day at the office. So this scene here is actually Sally B, which is the English-based B-17 that's still airworthy. They had rudders and vertical stabilizers that they put on the airplane for these taxiing scenes to make it look like the Belle was actually shot up. So you're looking at a real B-17 here with parts of it blown out. But again, that was all stuff that was added to that. But again, really neat that they actually had a real B-17 look chewed up.
For sure. The photo is the actual Margaret Polk.
Yep.
The real Memphis Belle. So a very nice tip of the hat to the real person who was the inspiration for the
I'm really glad that they included that in this film.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting, the dedication here at their end, where they say dedicated to all the brave young men, whatever their nationality.
Yes.
There's this theme of unanimity that we see here in the end. And I think that was common in the attitudes among World War II veterans in the 1980s and the 1990s. And I think it's very similar to what we see with Civil War veterans in, let's say, the 1900s and the 1910s, where for the sake of politics and unity, we're going to let bygones be bygones and say, hey, like, we really weren't that different after all. We were young men fighting a war for our countries, which in one hand is noble, and then on the other hand, I think is very dangerous because it also can lead to false equivalency.
Yep.
So we're eager to hear your thoughts on that when it comes to historical memory. So there we have it. We have Memphis Belle, one of our childhood favorites. A good, nostalgic, classically made Hollywood film, but not without its embellishments and inaccuracies.
Yep, yeah, there's a few. I think the movie really stays to the true form of the wartime movies that were made, of the pro-patriotism and pro-Americana, and really pushing the war effort, if you will. And I think Catherine Weiler did a really good job of trying to really pay homage to her dad's film.
Yes.
For that whole war bond, mentality that was going on when the original one was made. At the conclusion of this, how do you not want to run out and wave the flag and just be proud of our country for that story.
Yeah. I think it's also a product of sort of that 1980s Reagan era patriotism as well that was prevalent at that time. And I have no doubt that this film was probably made to cater to the generation that went through the war. I mean, this is definitely a movie that I think World War II veterans would have gone to see.
Yeah, I think a lot of them did. I mean, I remember going to, again, air shows in the 90s after this movie came out and seeing David Talascia's B-17 and how many, even in Pittsburgh, I remember at Beaver County Airport, they had the Beaver County Air Show, the movie Memphis Belle was there, and how many bomber crew members or members of the 8th Air Force or the 9th Air Force from World War II had their baseball hats on with the 8th or 9th, and they were so proud to be part of that story. And as a little kid seeing it, I couldn't wait to go talk to an actual B-17 pilot or a waist gunner from a B-17. And the patriotism and the sense of pride was definitely there.
Yeah, and I feel sad for people younger than you and I, because we are of the last generation that really had the opportunity to converse with World War II veterans in a meaningful way. So the work that you do with your organization, the work I try to do in the classroom and on this channel, pass the torch and carry on the stories.
There's definitely interest there. And I think it's important that we keep doing what we're doing to keep those stories going and make sure those memories aren't forgotten.
Amen. Before we head out, I have another fun anecdote or two. And one of them has to do with the fact that I've met Sean Astin. I've met him twice. He came to speak at my campus, and during the Q&A session after his presentation, which was actually on mental health and mental well-being, appropriately enough, people were asking him about Lord of the Rings, they were asking him about Stranger Things, a few of them were asking about the Goonies, a random one about Rudy, and then my question was about Memphis Belle. And he was so happy because he said, I never get any questions about Memphis Belle when I go to speak somewhere. And I said, well, I can do you one better because I brought my movie and Sean Astin signed it for me. So there's his signature, and then he wrote Rascal underneath.
Awesome.
So, I love this. He also signed my DVD copy of Rudy for me, which we also need to check out on this channel sometime. Made just 3 years after this one. And it was really wonderful because the crowd had dispersed by this point, and I actually had the opportunity to have a meaningful conversation with him. And he said the two things that stuck out to him the most while making this movie, one was the sense of scale. He said when you went onto the set, it felt like you were being transported back in time. It was a very immersive set, that there was a true sense of camaraderie between he and his fellow actors as they were making all of this. And he said it was, in some ways, a very easy film to make because they felt very much at home in the environs and working with each other.
I couldn't imagine being on that set and being a part of that.
Yeah. And the other thing that he remembered, one of the most meaningful things for him, was the day that the actual veterans of the Memphis Belle came to the set and they met their real-life counterparts. Now, his counterpart was already passed away, unfortunately. But he said it was these short men were old and had white hair, but he said they seemed like giants to us. And after their day of touring the set, the actors and the veterans went out to an English pub.
Oh, wow.
And they essentially got into a drinking contest, very much like reliving the sort of bomber life in a 1940s English village. And Sean Astin said those World War II veterans outdrank every one of us.
Don't doubt that at all.
We could not compete with them. And he said those were his two most memorable recollections of being in that film.
What a great experience to take away from that movie set. I mean, out of all the things he could have talked about, it was going out with the original crew.
Yeah,
you know?
absolutely. So I'm really glad to get to meet him, talk with it, get my DVD signed, and awesome. Share some of those memories with all of you. So that wraps it up for this episode of Real History. Jason, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
For driving from the Pittsburgh area to come and join us and to share your expertise. Once again, we invite you to check the video caption below. Visit the website for Beach City Baby. Follow them on Facebook and try to visit them at an air show. I don't think you'll regret it at all. So thank you for the work you do.
Oh, thanks for having me today. It was an honor to be here.
All right. And maybe we'll see you at another episode at a future point.
I'd be honored to.
All right. Thank you all so much. We'll see you next time on Real History, and until then, stay curious.